Imagine walking through a 15th century marketplace and finding a crowd more desperate than any modern-day product launch. At the center stands a man, not selling spices or fine silks, but holding a stack of simple parchment. He looks a grieving widow in the eye and tells her with absolute authority that for a handful of silver, her husband's soul will literally leap out of the fires of purgatory and into heaven. He even has a catchy jingle for it. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was, quite arguably, the most brilliant business model ever conceived. The product, it cost nothing to manufacture, required no shipping, and its effectiveness could only be verified after the customer was dead. The Vatican had effectively turned the fear of eternal damnation into a global revenue stream. At the time, this wasn't seen as a shady back-alley deal. It was the gold standard of spiritual security. This subscription to heaven built the most breathtaking cathedrals in Europe and funded the most powerful armies on earth. It was a system that seemed untouchable. But then the atmosphere shifted. What looked like a divine favor to the masses began to look like a shakedown to the observant. A single monk named Martin Luther started looking at the ledgers and the theology, and he didn't see salvation. He saw a scam. He wasn't just looking to debate religion. He was looking to dismantle a multi-billion-dollar business empire. What's truly striking isn't just the audacity of the Middle Ages, but how familiar the pattern feels today. We look back at these indulgences and laugh at the gullibility of the past, yet we live in an era of pay-to-play politics and high-level nonprofits that operate on nearly the same logic. The tools have evolved, and the parchment has been replaced by digital wire transfers and lobbying, but the game using influenced by a clean slate remains exactly the same.
It does, and that historical setup is so critical. It really defines the foundational problem we're going to be digging into today.
The transactional purchase of moral legitimacy.
Exactly. And so our mission in this deep dive is to track this core mechanism, this act of buying absolution across three huge institutional fields today.
Okay, where are we going to be looking?
We're going to be examining how these secular indulgences bypass actual merit, first of all, and then how they, dangerously dissolve social bonds, and maybe most perniciously, how they erode the foundational trust that civilization depends on.
So we're starting with corporate governance, the idea that things like ESG mandates are a new way for elite institutions to just buy a clean moral slate and sidestep traditional merit.
That's the first pillar. Then we'll move into a sort of Durkheimian analysis of institutional decay, comparing the church's financialization of salvation to the modern nonprofit industrial complex.
And how that dissolves our social cohesion.
Right. And finally, we'll look at the sociological transition from religious absolution to what some call the therapeutic state, where ideological signaling and pay-to-play politics, they're the new solvent for our norms and institutional trust.
Okay, so let's unpack that first one. The core mechanism is you're replacing quality or inherent moral worth with a simple financial transaction.
Or a symbolic one.
A symbolic one, yes. And we are seeing this play out so clearly today in the modern boardroom.
Right. Where corporate mandates like ESG, environmental, social, and governance scoring are becoming this new currency of moral standing.
It is, I think, the perfect illustration of how institutional legitimacy can be purchased, and in the process, it just overrides genuine merit and technical excellence.
I was really struck by the story of a master mason from the 1490s in Saxony. His name was Friedrich.
Okay.
And this man, Friedrich, he had dedicated his entire life, we're talking 2 decades of intense, rigorous work, to perfecting the structural integrity of his town's bridge arches. It was his craft.
So he's the embodiment of skill.
Of merit.
Absolutely. He saw his work, his technical excellence, as his direct line to the divine. It was a genuinely meritorious path to respect, to reward. He was the local economy, in a way. Quality focus.
In this man's world, his whole view of how things should work, it was about to be completely disrupted, wasn't it?
Totally. A representative from the Roman Building Fund shows up in town, and he's selling what was called a plenary indulgence.
The ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card?
For your entire family line. It promised to clear the buyer's whole lineage of all debt, past and future. So the local nobleman, instead of judging contractors based on skill or reputation or the 20 years of proven excellence that Friedrich represented,
he just looked at who paid the most.
He awarded the incredibly lucrative contract for the new cathedral wing to a financier. And why? Because that financier had donated the largest sum to the Roman Building Fund. The money, the moral purchase, was the only thing that mattered, not the competence of the mason.
That anecdote just perfectly encapsulates the core parallel we're talking about. Friedrich represents a kind of moral economic order where legitimacy flows from skilled work, from long-term quality.
From actually being good at what you do.
Right. And the nobleman, by buying that indulgence, he essentially purchased a clean slate. It's a moral asset, and he immediately leveraged it to override the entire existing meritocratic system.
And gave a huge public contract to someone based purely on a financial transaction with a distant power, not on local proven competence.
And that is exactly the problem today. You can have a brilliant engineer who is focused entirely on making the product faster or safer or more efficient, pure technical excellence.
The modern day Friedrich.
The modern Friedrich. And that person may get completely bypassed for a critical leadership role because the firm needs to signal its compliance to the market.
They have to appoint a director with a background of top ESG scores.
And just like that, the value of actual, difficult, high-quality work becomes secondary to the performance of virtue, or, the purchase of a clean, high-scoring slate.
So let's talk about the mechanism of ESG itself. How does it actually facilitate this? The literature you pointed me to describes it as what was the phrase? A tentacle of financialization.
Yes, or marketization. It takes these incredibly complex qualitative aspects of how a company is run. Things like ethical supply chains or community impact or long-term environmental stewardship.
Things that are really hard to measure.
Exactly, and it aggressively reduces them into quantitative scores. The technical term for this process is commensuration.
Commensuration. That term itself, it sounds like one of the most powerful tools for social governance we've seen in a long time. How does that process work at a high level?
Well, it works by collapsing all these diverse qualities, which, might be understood very differently in different contexts. And it collapses them into a single, standardized, easily comparable unit.
You're turning moral behavior into data points.
Precisely. And then you use that data to place entire companies on a common, competitive, quantifiable scale. And once you have that score, you can rank them, reward them, invest in them, or exclude them based on that number alone.
Regardless of the messy reality behind the number.
The messy reality becomes irrelevant. So instead of having to, say, understand the complex historical relationship between a German car manufacturer and its union.
You just look at the S-score in their ESG rating.
Just look at the S-score. That numerical rating becomes the new, and in many cases, the only metric of trustworthiness.
And you can see how this would create immense tension, especially in places like Europe. The high-status corporate boards there, they're traditionally embedded in these very relational cooperative systems.
Yes. Sociologists call this implicit corporate social responsibility, or implicit CSR. In that older system, responsibility wasn't defined by a checklist or a score. It grew out of consensus, deep social obligations, and very close integration with stakeholders like labor unions or government regulators.
So they would say they were already doing the social good, just implicitly. And then ESG comes along as this explicit competitive market metric, trying to put a score on something that was always cooperative and relational. That must feel like an invasion.
It's often viewed by those entrenched elites as a penetration of neoliberalism. That's the term they use. The explicit competitive market logic that's inherent in ESG scoring. It directly challenges the moral and, frankly, the pragmatic legitimacy of their traditional consensus-based systems.
They're looking at the score and thinking, does this actually reflect the decades of work we've put in?
Or is it just a strategic posture designed purely to appease the global capital market? Is this real, or is it a performance for investors?
This clash seems to lead us directly to what the research calls the elite loyalty test, and it unpacks it through this concept of nestedness, basically, how cohesive and exclusive an elite board is.
Right. And your first thought, your logical assumption, would be that the absolute highest status boards, the ones bound by this old idea of noblesse oblige, the social obligation of the privileged, they should be the most resistant to this crass competitive market logic.
They're the old guard. They should be protecting the old ways.
They should resist. Their status is tied to that old relational system.
Yeah.
They're the ones who built the cathedral based on Friedrich's skill, not the nobleman's coin. They are the gatekeepers of that traditional legitimacy model.
But the research shows something completely unexpected. It shows an inverted U shape when it comes to compliance.
It does, which is fascinating.
So tell us what that inverted U shape actually reveals about this power hierarchy.
Well, it shows that the probability of appointing a director with a top ESG score, someone who signals alignment with this new explicit market pricing logic, it doesn't peak in the highest status boards.
The most entrenched, the most nested boards, they're actually the most resistant.
They often are. Instead, the peak occurs in the middle status boards.
Okay, so why is that? Why is the defection coming from the middle, and why is that so dangerous for the old guard?
I think it's a dynamic of strategic advancement, the nonconformity, the adoption of this new transactional metric. It seems to originate from these well-positioned actors who are just outside the inner core.
So the highest elite, they can afford to be contemptuous of the new score. They're protected by decades of built-up relational trust.
They feel they're above it. But the middle status boards, they are less protected by that traditional system, but they're still prestigious enough to attract directors who have this new ESG reputation.
So they use the ESG score as a weapon.
Precisely. They are using the new market pricing logic as a way to advance their own status, to challenge the entrenched power structure. It's a power move that's disguised as moral conformity.
They're leveraging this standardized ESG score, this new moral property, to try to outcompete their superiors and gain market access or investment attention.
Which means that the ESG score effectively translates corporate social effort into a state that's akin to property or potency owned by an individual.
It becomes a marketable asset.
Yes. And that fundamentally changes the nature of social responsibility. It's no longer a collective, deeply embedded obligation, that old implicit CSR. It's now an individually owned, highly liquid, marketable asset.
It's the modern way the financier bought the contract from Friedrich. The moral status, now quantified by a score, just steamrolls the actual quality of the work.
That's a transaction.
And that shift from a collective social obligation to an individual marketable asset, that is a staggering conceptual jump. If the corporate world is busy buying these private moral assets, that moves us pretty neatly to our next institutional field, the nonprofit world, where the financialization of community bonds is, you could argue, eroding organic social cohesion. We're looking at the institutional decay, a kind of Durkheimian analysis of the modern nonprofit industrial complex.
This is a perfect pivot because we're shifting from the legitimacy of a corporation to analyzing the very glue that holds a community together. What happens when you monetize that glue and export it? It's a question that was central to the sociologist Emile Durkheim.
So let's go back to that other story, the one about the Rhineland parish during the height of the indulgence trade. For centuries, you have this small village, and it operates on a system of pure organic social cohesion.
Right.
If a barn burns down, the whole village rebuilds it. There's no invoice. If a widow is hungry, the baker gives her a loaf of bread, maybe on credit, maybe for free. It was a mercy of the neighbor system.
Interdependence and shared suffering.
Exactly. The problem is solved locally, and the solution itself reinforces the bonds of the community.
And that localized reciprocal mechanism is what Durkheim would call organic solidarity. Society is held together by, yes, the functional interdependence of specialized parts, but also by those thick human relationships, shared experience.
But then the financialization begins. The local priest starts demanding that coins be dropped into the indulgence box instead of helping the neighbor rebuild the barn. The transaction replaces the relationship.
And where did that coin go?
It flowed straight out of the community. It went across the Alps to Rome to pay for grand basilicas, distant wars, papal opulence, and the community's internal support system just decayed.
Because charity, which should have been local human connection, had been financialized and exported to a distant bureaucratic institution.
The moment the money flowed out, the neighbor was lost in the ledger.
Absolutely. And the modern nonprofit industrial complex, or the MPOUA, it parallels this institutional decay with, I think, startling accuracy. The local relationship-driven soup kitchen spirit. It's often replaced by a professionalized global bureaucratic machine.
The scale is just immense. We're talking about massive global charities with billion-dollar endowments, huge administrative complexity, and sometimes very little actual presence in the specific communities they're supposed to be serving.
And the problem isn't just the bureaucracy itself. It's what's known as mission drift.
Mission drift.
The organizational mission shifts. It moves away from solving the underlying systemic problem and toward just maintaining the nonprofit itself. And of course, catering to the funder's expectations.
So if a nonprofit's revolutionary goal was to, say, ensure universal health care, but that goal is politically disruptive to its major funders,
the organization might de-radicalize. So instead of campaigning for that systemic change, they focus purely on, say, opening a few temporary health clinics. They end up managing the symptom rather than curing the disease.
They become adept at managing the fallout of the system rather than changing the system itself.
And the self-preservation of the bureaucracy overrides the original, maybe revolutionary goal. This is a central criticism of the MPOIC. It can become a stabilizing force for the very structural inequalities it was founded to fight.
And this feeds directly into the unique dynamics of modern wealthy donors, doesn't it? They often treat their contributions less like charity, a selfless act, and more like investments.
Investments that have to yield specific returns. And often, those returns are substantial tax benefits.
Which changes the relationship completely. One of the major criticisms is that these wealthy individuals, they prioritize funding the visible stuff, the programmatic work, over the essential administrative or operational work.
They want to fund the good work, but not the infrastructure that makes the good work possible.
Right. Everyone wants to put their name on the solar panels or the new well, but nobody wants to fund the accounting department, the compliance team, or the electricity bill.
The pressure is just immense. Donors often insist on hearing that, 95 or even 100% of their money goes directly to the cause. This forces nonprofits to prioritize the appearance of efficiency, those low overhead numbers, over robust systemic function.
So the operational backbone of the organization is starved because the donors don't want to pay for what you do, only for what you can visually produce.
And so, just like the medieval indulgence, the modern system is optimized not for the actual efficacy of the good work, which requires robust, sometimes expensive administration, but for the moral satisfaction and financial benefit of the donor.
It's a subscription to heaven, where the ultimate product is the feeling of altruism, with a tax break built right in.
The transaction has replaced the genuine human relationship, and the community, those Rhineland villagers, they've lost their capacity for that localized reciprocal responsibility.
And if the MPOIC financializes our local bonds, then the next layer of this secular absolution ideological signaling, it sort of financializes our internal conviction. This brings us to that sociological transition from religious coercion to the secular therapeutic state.
This transition is all about the shift from external compliance with, say, theological truth to external compliance with psychological and social management norms.
Let's look closer at that story of the Florentine scholar Alessandro in 1510. He likely didn't believe that a piece of paper could literally lift a soul out of purgatory.
Probably not. But he lived in a world of constant social surveillance, a kind of nascent therapeutic state.
And to keep his prestigious position at the university, he wasn't asked to confess his secret beliefs. He was asked to perform compliance. He had to be seen at the front of every procession, loudly reciting prescribed prayers, publicly condemning those who failed to pay their tithes.
The key is that his survival depended entirely on his external image. It had to be a perfectly curated image of religious conformity. The historian Philip Rieff, he talked about this shift to a therapeutic state, where the traditional moral systems, the ones based on shared purpose and absolute religious truth, they just dissolve.
And they get replaced by systems that are focused on individual psychological adjustment and social management.
He didn't need to be pious. He needed to look pious and well-adjusted to the prevailing norms of the day.
That's a perfect mirror of ideological signaling in the modern digital public square, isn't it? Which operates on this constant, low-grade social surveillance.
It absolutely is. You see individuals adopting specific vocabulary, using the approved jargon, loudly supporting particular corporate causes or nonprofits.
And they do it not necessarily out of deep personal reflection, which is often messy and complex, but to maintain their institutional trust, to belong to this civilized circle.
We're all Alessandro in a way, trying desperately to prove we're pure enough to remain in the room.
It's a secular requirement to constantly signal your purity. And the core danger here seems profound. When social norms are dictated by who can afford to pay the highest price in public purity.
Whether that price is a financial contribution or extreme ideological conformity.
The capacity for honest, messy, genuinely human conversation is extinguished. The performance is just so loud it drowns out any authentic dissent.
And if the highest price is public tyranny, that brings us right to the engine of corruption that allows this whole transactional morality to flourish, particularly within activist and intellectual circles.
Right. Elite capture and the failure of deference epistemology.
This is, I would argue, the most intricate modern mechanism by which this symbolic exchange fails to translate into actual material change. We need to unpack deference epistemology very carefully.
Okay, so what are the foundational ideas of this standpoint epistemology that are, basically non-controversial? Where does the theory start and where does the practice go so wrong?
The foundation is quite sound. It really rests on three pretty non-controversial tenets. First, that knowledge is socially situated, meaning your perspective shapes what you know.
Makes sense.
Second, that marginalized people often have unique positional advantages in gaining certain kinds of knowledge about the systems that are oppressing them. And third, that our research programs should reflect these facts.
Okay, so that all seems entirely reasonable. It's just about acknowledging that perspective matters and should inform how we investigate things. So how does that become a trap for elite capture?
The problem arises when these tenets are converted into these highly ritualized deferential practices inside elite spaces. You get the ubiquitous calls to center the most marginalized or listen to the most affected.
And that transforms into practices like giving offerings, passing the mic.
Or simply believing the marginalized spokesperson uncritically.
So the admirable motivation, the desire for racial or social justice, that gets translated into a practice that often becomes self-defeating once you're in one of those rooms of power.
Because here's the brutal irony of it all. Access to the rooms of power, the editor's office, the prestigious conference room, the White House Situation Room, is already tightly gated by prior social advantage.
The filtering mechanisms of society.
Elite education, inherited wealth, class advantages, selective immigration laws, they all determine who is even allowed to speak on the national stage in the first place.
So the people who successfully navigate all of those severe social selection pressures, they are, by definition, systematically different from the truly marginalized people they're being asked to represent.
Exactly. They are the least likely to be incarcerated or unemployed or struggling with basic access to health care. They are in the room because of the ways in which they are already highly advantaged within the system. Their very presence signals a capacity for systematic upward mobility that often separates them from the broader, most affected group.
So when a high-profile journalist, for example, defers to a professor from a marginalized background, and they assume that person's background grants them some inherent, uncritical, experiential insight.
The practice directs immense prestige and resources to the most advantaged members of that group, the ones who are already credentialed, published, and employed.
That is the textbook definition of elite capture: the control over political agendas and resources by a group's most advantaged people.
And the deferential norms, they serve as a kind of cleansing ritual. They allow the deferrer, the one with privilege, to perform their purity while directing attention and status only to those who have already cleared the internal social hurdles of the elite world. It's an incredibly easy, low-cost transaction for them.
But hold on, if we don't center the marginalized, then how do we avoid just imposing the dominant group's framework on everything? Are we suggesting we just throw out standpoint epistemology entirely?
No, not at all. We're suggesting that the practice of deference, when it's applied uncritically within these existing elite structures, fails to achieve its stated goal. The goal is material change. The outcome is often just symbolic validation.
And this leads to the failure of symbolic exchange, something that's been cynically called racial Reaganomics.
A provocative term, but a useful one.
Okay, detail this fantasy. This idea about the exchange rate between the attention economy and the material economy.
It's reliant on the fantasy that if you focus sufficient attention on the suffering or on the spokespeople, if you achieve what's called conversational prestige, then the resulting moral and political capital will somehow trickle down into material benefits for the working class or the slum dwellers.
But attention isn't a finite resource in that way. Directing attention to a high-status spokesperson doesn't diminish the material oppression of the group they represent. It mainly just enhances the career and the status of the spokesperson.
It absolutely fails on its own terms. These attention-focused campaigns like, squabbles over who used the right jargon in an op-ed, they redirect political energy away from the need to fundamentally change the social system that marginalizes the entire group.
So if your goal is to redistribute social resources, focusing purely on cultural authenticity or the most cosmetically radical description of the problem is, it's a disastrous political strategy.
And furthermore, this deferential orientation, by emphasizing these fine-grained differences between groups, it prevents the necessary construction of large, powerful coalitional politics. It becomes ultimately anti-political.
Okay, so if the indulgence of deference fails, what is the constructive alternative? How do you practice accountability in a way that actually generates real-world outcomes?
A constructive approach has to fundamentally shift the focus away from moral principles like avoiding your own complicity or signaling your purity and toward focusing on end results,
Which are
redistributing social resources and power. And critically, building institutions that embody that power. It demands accountability not to the people already in the room, but to the people who are not yet in the room.
This is about world making, not just regulating conversational traffic within the existing privileged room.
The Flint water crisis is the defining proof of concept for this. Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality, the MDEQ, they spoke from a position of absolute high-status governmental authority. They defended the status quo with a doctored report.
They had 50 trained scientists claiming the water was safe to drink, and the residents were marginalized, poor, and primarily black.
The residents didn't need their oppression centered or celebrated. They needed the lead out of the water. They needed a material intervention.
So what they needed was epistemic authority to challenge that powerful government body and the systems defending it.
And they built it. They built a new room through a citizen science campaign, collaborating actively with outside, accredited scientists who could run the relevant tests and prove the MDEQ's report was fraudulent. They didn't win because an elite journalist passed the mic or professor deferred to them. They won because they developed independent, authoritative knowledge.
And that new authority forced material change. The $600 million settlement, the overhaul of the city's water pipes. It shows that political energy should be focused on the practical and material basis for popular power.
Power over knowledge production, yes. Rather than these endless, draining battles over conversational prestige. The biggest threats to social justice today are not the lack of jargon to describe suffering. They are the systemic erosion and corruption of the practical basis for action corporate monopolization, the looting of institutional resources, the domination of elite interests in high-status research.
And confronting those threats requires leaving the old rooms and building new ones where power is genuinely redistributed, which requires an understanding of how status itself operates to maintain itself, and why elites allocate these secular indulgences, whether they're ESG scores, conversational prestige, or huge grants.
Exactly. It takes us back to the highest levels of the hierarchy and what you could call the iron cage of status.
So high status is fundamentally a social governance mechanism. It provides stability, it provides order.
Yes, the community, the population, it accords high-status actors disproportionate credit and benefits, social value. But this privilege is only justified if the leader fulfills their responsibility to allocate resources wisely, to choose partnerships and directions that benefit the whole.
So the community grants the leader this high status and trust because they expect the leader to act as a fiduciary for the long-term well-being of the population. They're trusted to choose partners who will secure the living of the species, so to speak.
Exactly. The leader is held accountable in their choices. The allocation of value-granting status, attention, affiliation, it isn't misappropriation if the leader passes the test of social judgment in their selection. They are deemed authoritative for their choices. This is why high-status players get disproportionate credit. The credit is for fulfilling the responsibility to select the partners that will carry the field forward effectively.
But that high-status position, which is sustained by this requirement to choose effective and credible frames and to prove your sustained contribution, it can become an iron cage. The expectations are crushing.
And this leads us to the final and I think profoundly deep sociological question about the nature of modern elites, particularly when they operate within this transactional logic we've been discussing all this time. Are these high-status actors still autonomous agents? Are they exercising genuine free will and moral judgment when they allocate value and choose their partners?
Or have they become what Marx termed capital personified?
And we should define that term properly. When Marx complained that capitalism turns into this anonymous machine, he meant that the individual human actor, even the rich capitalist, ceases to operate based on moral choice or free will.
Instead, they become what? A functionary.
The functional representative. The personification of capital. They are compelled only by the coercive, inescapable logic of competition and ceaseless valorization.
So the elite actor is no longer a moral agent, but merely a tool, a cog in the machine, maximizing value accumulation according to the market's coercive laws.
Precisely. And when ESG scores become a marketable asset property owned by an individual or a corporation, it shifts the nature of the elite's participation. If Martin Luther were to walk into the modern Vatican of ESG today, would the current cardinal even have the moral agency to rebel? Or would he be compelled by the coercive laws of the market to simply maximize the score regardless of his internal conviction?
The question is whether our elites are genuinely defending traditional values of, communal sharing and quality, or if they are just maximizing their value according to the new market logic of the secular indulgence.
And the core struggle then is whether the elite is acting as an independent moral agent or simply as a functionary for this ceaseless value accumulation.
And we have seen this same transactional pattern repeat in every institutional sphere we've analyzed today, from the corporate board all the way to the activist movement.
We've tracked how the payment of a political or symbolic fee, the secular indulgence, consistently replaces the requirement for actual moral, technical, or social work.
It replaces merit in corporate governance, organic cohesion in community charity, and authentic conviction in the public square.
And that sociological transition from religious absolution to the current therapeutic state of ideological signaling, it reveals a fundamental tension. This relentless external requirement to conform and signal purity completely replaces internal conviction.
The resulting elite capture focuses political energy on battles over conversational prestige and attention. Who gets to be heard? Who gets the mic? Who can describe the carnage most incisively?
And that comes at the expense of the difficult world-making project of actually redistributing social resources and power itself. We're left contemplating whether our modern institutions prioritize collective liberation or simply mere parochial advantage.